Welcome to the Zoological Society of London, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrew Terry. I'm the Director of Conservation and Policy for ZSL. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you here, to welcome you to ZSL and to this symposium. And it's lovely to be able to sort of say a few kind of words of welcome for what is our second Seascape Symposium on reconnecting the seascape, which is really building on a lot of the outputs that were developed as a result of the first symposium in 2022. As an organization, ZSL is committed to kind of creating a world where wildlife thrives. And as my colleagues know, I'm one who loves to overuse the word thriving. But it's because I think it's a very important word. It captures the fact that persistence, the avoidance of extinction, or the mere presence of species or habitat isn't enough. It's because it is there to speak to a much longer journey of recovery. And it kind of speaks to and recognizes the overriding challenge we face to identify a way to balance the recovery and maintenance of resilient ecosystems alongside human needs and uses. And globally, as a global conservation organization, we've defined 10 regions around the world where we want to demonstrate the recovery of healthy ecosystems and the species that make them up. And for us, the UK's coastal zones are one of those kind of global priority regions. So this is an incredibly important topic for us going forward. And this symposium comes at a crucial time, I would say, for the environment both nationally and internationally. I think as people working in the environmental sector, it's probably easy right now to feel like things are actually sliding backwards, that we're facing a particular set of challenges. We're witnessing governments globally scaling back on their commitments, on their spending, whether it's at an international level through overseas development aid, or at a domestic level. Here in the UK, next week, we're probably going to see major cuts coming through the UK spending review. The papers are full of stories about companies rolling back, or reevaluating, or adjusting, or reconsidering, whatever phraseology they want to use, their commitments to sustainable practices. And we are constantly witnessing the outcomes or the results of a number of the environmental challenges we face. So we know we're in for difficult times ahead. But we're also witnessing, I would say, a far greater awareness of and focus of the environment than ever before. It's fair to say that the quality of our water, the quality of and the health of our aquatic environments are never far from the news. As countries and companies and communities, we have made commitments to halting biodiversity loss and rebuilding these damaged ecosystems. But we know that the pace of change is not happening at the level we need it to happen. Now, the thing is, you know much, much better than me how important our coastal habitats are to us. They're incredibly rich, incredibly diverse. They're important stores of carbon. They are havens for our marine biodiversity. They serve as coastal defenses, and they are important economic and cultural resources. They're also beautiful places to be in and to feel better. We have no end of evidence highlighting the state they are in, though. Our native oyster ecosystem is officially designated as collapsed. We've lost huge amounts of our seagrasses, our salt marshes, and we're seeing declines in kelp forests continue unabated. So we know what the problem is. We know that we face a number of real challenges. And I think the fundamental question is, what can we do to remain both hopeful and ambitious to address these challenges? And that's really what I think this symposium is all about. I believe that if we're going to be successful, if we're going to successfully address a number of these pressures on our ecosystems, we have to come together as a community. We cannot be the constituent bag of lots of different organizations and stakeholders doing their own thing in their own sort of backyard. The point is, we have to come together representing different institutional needs, different institutional backgrounds to scale up that ambition. And that narrative on recovering ecosystems into positions of health and resilience is also all about setting a positive and optimistic direction, a vision for what they could be and how we can get there. And of course, to achieve that, we're going to have to work really hard, and harder now than we have had to do before. We're going to have to work hard to be heard by our government and local authorities who are overwhelmed with competing needs for their resources. We're going to need to present companies with options, both to kind of mitigate the damage that happens, but also how they are going to invest in coastal restoration at scale. We also vitally need to bring our communities with us. For many people who are living along our coastal areas, or even those who just visit, we need to build literacy, passion, and engagement for a healthier environment. So these, hopefully, or I know, are going to be a number of the topics that you will be discussing over the next couple of days. We're going to talk about some priority themes about how do we raise ambition and scale for habitat recovery. What are some of the principles of seascape restoration? We're going to hear a number of examples of innovations in practice and engagement, working with communities, how we can really kind of build connections, whether that's around enhancing ecological connectivity or really joining up different types of interventions in new and innovative ways. So with that in mind, it's going to be a fascinating 2 days. And I really want to start by saying a massive thank you to you, to everyone who's in the room, to everyone who's online joining us for this symposium. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our speakers and poster makers. We will have a poster session in the room behind us in the Bartlett Suite. Please do take time to see that. I also want to extend a huge thank you to our co-organisers from the Universities of Portsmouth and Edinburgh, without whom this wouldn't be possible. And we're also really pleased that this event is affiliated with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, because it's these connections to global ambition that are always really important to reinforce. And we'll be welcoming Melissa de Kock, who's the Deputy Director at UNEP WCMC, who's going to give us a keynote talk on behalf of the Decade later today. So the format for today, for the symposium, is we're going to have 3 presentation sessions, followed by our keynote and a discussion panel. And we'll be taking questions from the audience after each talk. So please, over the next couple of days, do come talk to new colleagues, new contacts. Please share your experiences, raise your questions. Let's see if we can build new partnerships and new collaborations, because we really do need to continue to build this shared momentum for the recovery of our coastal ecosystems. So thank you very much, and with that I'm going to hand over to Alison Debney, who's going to chair our first session on principles and drivers of seascape restoration. Thank you.
thank you very much, Andrew. That was an inspiring set of words, and I was going to add a bit about how we try and draw everyone together and convene here at ZSL to drive conservation science forward for a world where wildlife thrives or where ecosystems are recovered. But I think you said it so well, I'm just going to leave it there and move on to the exciting part of starting the symposia. Here we go. Woohoo! I'm super excited to chair this first session. I think we've got some of the world's leading seascape scientists presenting over the next few days, and this first session is really setting that foundation, that where we're going to push this new area of science forward, this conservation science forward, so that we can build confidence, so that we enable in delivering our work, but enable confidence in those decision makers as well. We've got to use our work to be able to drive policy, regulation, investment going forward. And so what we hope we gather from today is sort of the consensus that from the next few days, the consensus, the knowledge sharing, the challenges and challenging each other. But underneath it is the strong science. So I'm delighted, first of all, to invite Joanne Preston up from University of Portsmouth, who's going to be presenting some really exciting work and building on the last symposium about how our understanding of connectivity across the seascape can support those policy goals for effective, ambitious marine recovery, which is what we're all working towards. Sorry, and here it is. Thank you. Good luck.
Hi, it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces, but also new, so welcome. So first of all, today I'm going to present the outputs of the first symposium and the workshop, and I want to state immediately that this is a collaborative effort that I'm presenting on behalf of all these co-authors and also the many, many members of the first symposium and workshop, so the credit is very much shared. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how we got here. Back in 2017, I remember having just before then a very small meeting in the Bartlett Room, around 12 of us, as we worked out whether we wanted to set up an oyster network. But both the UK and EU networks are set up, and we work together with other restoration communities to write these restoration how-to handbooks, very much driven by the Environment Agency. And as we started working together, we realised how much we were working in silos. And at the same time, Rememory strategy was launched. And the following year, the Seascape Symposium I came together to try and get all these people to start connecting both the expertise, the knowledge, and work out how we deliver restoration across these habitats in an ecologically coherent way. That coincided with the Södertörn Seascape programme, and the Endangered Landscapes programme had a massive tranche of funding and expanded to seascapes programmes as well. And then we started to see the power of these networks. Just over 5 years, there's a tenfold increase in oyster restoration sites across Europe. And that's because of the effectiveness and the power of people. And then last year, the sister Seagrass Alliance was formed, and the EU Restoration Law was ratified. And now we're halfway through the end decades on ecosystem restoration and ocean science. So really, there's no time to lose. So the triple planetary crisis that humanity has both caused and now face is an interlinked phenomenon that's played out at the land-sea interface. And we're all aware of the ecosystem services delivered by marine systems on this lovely wheel here by Nature Scott. And it's these ecosystem services that nature-based solutions depend on to deliver the climate mitigation, the pollution remediation, and reverse the biodiversity loss. And this is underpinned by connectivity. Therefore, if you lose the coastal habitats, you lose the coastal ecosystem services. And we know that we have lost our coastal habitat. Over the last 200 years, we have decimated our temperate coastal habitats, as you can see from these rather depressing statistics on the slide. And we also know that reversing this recovery is essential for achieving our international goals of sustainable development, biodiversity and climate. And particularly the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 2, which is reflected in the EU Restoration Law, to ensure by 2030 that 20% of areas of degraded coastal marine ecosystems are under effective restoration in order to enhance biodiversity, ecosystem functions and services, ecological integrity, and connectivity. So we thought, if you're going to restore connectivity, you better know what it is. And we realised we didn't really understand very deeply the ecological connectivity across marine temperate seascapes. And so, bouncing off the last symposium, we've been working on the last 2 years to try and do a deep dive, come up with some definitions collectively for seascape restoration, really see what ecological connectivity means when it's applied to the marine environment, identify knowledge gaps, see how this relates to ecosystem service delivery, and how this can impact both our restoration practice and policy. So that's what I'm going to go over today. So, seascape restoration. We define it as a restoration of multiple habitats concurrently or sequentially to restore functionality, resilience, and connectivity across a mosaic of habitats in a marine ecosystem. And these definitions are derived collectively, including by external consultation. And sometimes we get a bit hot under the collar around the definitions of ecological restoration or rewilding, which one's better, which one's more effective, which one's all this, that, and the other. But actually, we take a broader approach, and we think about the ecosystem restoration spectrum to reflect the decade. And we took the restoration continuum from SER, developed terrestrial ecosystems, and brought it round into a circle to make the seascape ecosystem restoration. And ecological restoration and rewilding are both tools you can use, and it is depending on the context which one is most aptly applied. Ideally, you just want to reduce impact, and nature does the rest. But unfortunately, we've got to such an ecological phase shift in some systems, such as oyster reef, you have to work a bit harder to get to this point. So we defined ecological seascape restoration, and before we delved into looking at connectivity, we thought we'd better explain what we mean when we're talking about the coastal seascape. And so we define it as a mosaic of interacting habitats occupying the environment across time and space, that are ecologically and physically connected via bodies of water through which organisms, genetic material, non-living matter and energy flow. And in the paper, we look at the scales at which this connectivity operates over, which reflects some of the amazing work that Maria Vozzo's done about facilitative interactions. And what it highlights is that the seascape is a really interactive place where social, atmospheric and marine processes interact, and therefore is at risk of harm, but also offers such incredible potential for the benefit of people and planet. So first of all, we had to do a bit of a dive into conceptualizing ecological connectivity, because a lot of the concepts were mostly applied to landscape and terrestrial systems, particularly when it comes to restoration. And if we look at the IUCN definition of the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth for terrestrial systems, we thought, well, let's get the evidence to support that. I quite like Orford's definition as well. It's a bit more boring, but also quite tangible. And connectivity, ecological connectivity, is often split up into structural and functional components. And structural connectivity describes the permeability of the seascape arising from the physical characteristics, such that it confers functional connectivity for things like stepping stones. And functional connectivity describes response of organisms to this structure and the exchanges that entail, and influences the transfer of non-living matter and energy from one location to the next. And the underlying mechanism that facilitates is the process facilitates this connectivity, such as water flow, swimming, drifting, or active filtration. Now, that's a bit dry, so we thought we'd try to bring it into a framework of conceptualizing ecological connectivity in the marine environment. And as a whole consortia, we came up with lots of different examples of structural connectivity, functional connectivity, and identified all the mechanisms we can think of that mediate this and how they affect ecosystem services. And what is notable, both anthropogenic pressures have top-down forces exerting on it, and the geomorphological and abiotic processes will influence also. And that's important to remember. But that's also a bit boring, so we made it into a pretty picture. And this explains that the relationship between structural, functional, and mechanisms. And I'll just take the animals moving, for example. So the distance between habitats, their area or their patch size, will affect the animal movement as it goes through its ontogenic life stages. And this is obviously facilitated by swimming and sometimes currents. So in our review, we whittled it down to 304 publications that had quantitative analysis of ecological connectivity in the temperate environment. And this deep dive was sponsored and funded by Blue Marine Foundation and led by UKCH. And I want to give a particular shout out to Joanna Harley, who I don't think is here, but who did an amazing job bringing the database together, which is available on Figshare for anyone to download and use. But you can see that there's a real bias. Most of the information came from Northern Europe, Eastern North America, and a bit of Australia. And there's a whole gap missing here in South America. So that's probably because we didn't include traditional ecological knowledge and we just did first language English papers. So we split up the paper into looking at evidence of ecological connectivity, functional connectivity around nutrients, carbon and biodiversity to reflect the triple planetary crisis. And I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of the examples we came up with. So, for example, in California, you have increased shoot size and leaf growth of seagrass meadows adjacent to oyster beds due to the uptake of ammonium excreted from the oysters. In Chesapeake Bay, Chrysotria vicinica reefs enhanced denitrification up to almost 300% compared to the control, and this is just minorly mediated when co-located by salt marshes and seagrasses because they also do that. When you look at carbon, everyone knows the story. The presence of sea otters and kelp forests exert top-down grazing control, and this increases carbon production up to 13 times. Shellfish reefs filter feeding increases light availability and increases seagrass primary production and enhances organic carbon storage. Healthy seagrass ecosystems can buffer ocean acidification at coastal scales, benefiting all the shell and skeleton building fauna. Now, these are artificial categories. You could put this in the carbon or the biodiversity, but we've stuck it in biodiversity. The flow of organic carbon from kelp to fjords cross-subsidise reef fish density via provision of basal organic matter to quite large degrees. When you lose kelp forests, you lose 90% of macrobenthic communities. And seascapes connected with salt marsh, seagrass and kelp exhibit increased in-fauna diversity, fishery biomass and trophic complexity. So, we better start joining our restoration efforts together because this is the way the environment operates. So once we started bringing this evidence together, we thought, what does this mean for ecosystem service delivery? And this is a fairly bad table to present on a slide, but what it is all the ecosystem services from that blue wheel at the beginning and all the main biogenic habitats. And the darker the colour means it's peer-reviewed, mid-blue, there's some grey literature, light blue, expert opinion, white, no data. And what you can see is a multitude of habitats confer a multitude of ecosystem services across different ecological niches. More habitats means more resilience. And this is just all the evidence is in a supplementary information with all the papers, and we've linked it to what Sustainable Development Goals and specific targets they help deliver. So already, more habitats is better if we're going to achieve those international goals. But that's just them putting the evidence for each one together and making it look impressive. This, however, was a slightly more difficult bit of work that Tom Worthington and Philine Ermgassen led on this section of the paper. And what we wanted to do is find out where quantitative evidence of connectivity was shown to modulate provision of an ecosystem service. The first thing, if it's just a blank square, there's no data. So there's loads of work for us to do. If there's a circle in it, it means there's some evidence from our database. The bigger the circle, the stronger the interaction. If the circle's blue, it's a positive interaction. If it's orange, it's negative. If it's white, it's neutral. So each of these matrices represent one of these habitats indicated by the little icon, and then it compares it to the other habitats along these different ecosystem services. And what you can see is a couple of them have a mixed review of some positive and negative. And for example, when oyster reefs are next to seagrasses, you have a massive increase in the crab population, which then go onto the mudflats and eat all the infaunal bivalves. But this is moderated by the impact of seagrass presence. And so it depends on whether you're a crab fisher or a clam fisher, whether you think that's a positive interaction. So it's always context dependent. But then we thought that was a little bit boring, so we decided to make it into the Seascape Connectivity Tube Map, which went through around 1,000 iterations. And I'm just going to explain what this is all about. This is taking the evidence where connectivity modulates ecosystem service delivery in a positive way and puts it into a pretty picture. So the blue line, wave attenuation by habitats increases coastal protection and increased sediment. And these icons represent the different ecosystem services. The yellow line, movement of sediment between habitats increases nitrogen and carbon storage. Light pink, the animal movement between habitats enhances biodiversity, nursery function and fisheries production. Dark pink, the presence of habitats increases sediment stabilisation. Green, the benthic chlorophyll is a food source for oysters. Where this is higher, oysters have greater biomass and the filtration draws down more carbon. Brown, macroalgae drifting into seagrass meadows increases biodiversity and also for deep shore adjacent areas. Grey, that's the story with the oyster reefs and the crabs and seagrasses. Dark blue, oh, there we go. Denitrification mediated by salt marsh increases water clarity and increases carbon sequestration in seagrass. And orange, benthopelagic coupling by mussels increases availability of nutrients for seagrasses, increasing seagrass growth, and filtration by oysters reduces seagrass wasting disease. So it starts to make sense that we need to take advantage of all these feedback loops if we're going to meet our international goals and not just look at habitats in isolation. So to conclude, what we wanted to do, and this came out in this lovely glossy report that was led by Blue and Angus, is really come up with a statement that can help us lobby policymakers that has all this evidence behind it. And we're saying that seascape restoration is rooted in the understanding that coastal ecosystems are dynamic and heterogeneous mosaics of habitats which are interconnected by water through which living organisms, matter and energy flow. The context and the configuration of a site and the connectivity between habitats will therefore shape the outcomes of restoration projects. And if we want to restore trophic webs and enhance biodiversity and ecosystem functioning to deliver these ecosystem services, we need the existence of a healthy mosaic of habitats maintained by the flows between them. If you acknowledge this interconnectivity, you have more effective and holistic management. And therefore, if you want to enhance connectivity and restore structure function, you need to take a seascape approach to have successful restoration. So how do we do this? We just come up with a few recommendations in the paper, and at the bottom here are all the amazing networks that already exist across a single habitat. And these are needed. We need this expert opinion to pioneer and develop a single habitat expertise, but we want to also to use these to facilitate knowledge exchange, develop skills and create guidance to deliver multiple habitat restoration. So therefore, when you are doing multiple habitat restoration, you need to bring in seascape ecology and connectivity into the planning stage. And Lisa Wedding's talk next will really speak to that. We also need to develop restoration and site suitability models, not just if it's suitable, but can you restore there to aid this restoration planning. And we need to develop decision-making tools to inform the order of habitat restoration, because there are causal chains that occur. You might want to restore oysters first before you do seagrasses if it enhances water quality. We shouldn't look at seascape restoration in isolation. It needs to be part of climate-smart marine spatial planning. And if we're going to achieve this at scale, we need to mature, which means our practice and innovation needs to develop in parallel with enabling regulation and licensing. And finally, I think this is the most striking thing. We need to learn whilst we're restoring. We can't wait to get all the data. Therefore, we need to align our monitoring frameworks with our research agendas and policy goals, which therefore also provides information to underpin finance markets. All of this is in the paper, which hopefully will be out by Friday if everyone to see. We also talk about some policy recommendation, and I'm not going to go into lots of depth because I'm aware of time. Oh, I've got some time. Sorry, I've obviously been speaking very fast. So we want to really transition, based on this evidence, we want to transition away from feature-based designations to assessments that do account for the connectivity and the delivery of ecosystem services. Not just for ecosystem services, but we need to take into account for those. And to do this, we need to recognise the impact of degraded baselines, so we're not restoring a failed system. And then we need to let those inform our nature targets. Our targets need to restore functionality and resilience for future climate scenarios. And we need to adopt whole site management that considers activities across the seascape and the effects of connectivity. And I think this understanding of connectivity really gives us an opportunity to integrate policy frameworks, and particularly the monitoring of them, across climate and biodiversity agendas. Monitoring is difficult, it's expensive, it takes a lot of time. We need a lot of innovation to make it better, faster. I'm going to hear about the incredible AI and other approaches to developing better monitoring and effective monitoring. But where we can, we need to streamline this monitoring reporting to effectively measure progress across these big agendas, so we don't reinvent the wheel and not know what the left hand and the right hand is doing. We do need to create seascape restoration metrics, particularly identify how do we measure connectivity, and that's what we're doing in our workshop on Friday. And we need to continue to develop the natural capital markets using these metrics which are aligned with the policy frameworks. And we go into a bit more detail in the paper. So I'd just like to finish with a couple of things. One of my favourite quotes, Rachel Carson, in Nature, nothing exists alone. So this is not new. We all know it intrinsically and fundamentally. All this work stands on the shoulders of giants, and now we're just turning that information towards seascape restoration. And, you know, I think those of us that have been sort of here from quite a while now, you always think it's impossible until it's done, and actually we're the people that need to do it. This is a QR code, not for the paper, unfortunately, but for the infographics, which are all available for anyone to download and use and lobby and get the word out there. So I just want to finish with a final word. So anthropogenic stressors have diminished nearly all coastal marine habitats, and globally all marine biomes are impacted by overfishing, pollution and climate change. To reverse the global trend of biodiversity loss, we need urgent, bold and effective restoration action. And I hope the evidence presented here is striking and clear. To achieve a healthy and resilient ocean, where marine ecosystems are understood, protected, restored and managed, and to deliver on climate mitigation and sustainability goals, we need to restore at seascape scales, reconnecting the matrix of coastal marine habitats to restore the resilience and functionality of the temperate seascape on which human well-being depends. And this is our little diagram that reviewer 3 thought wasn't needed, but I kept in anyway, that reflects that relationship and that need to stay connected. And so with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the funders and everyone of the first symposium. And there's my contacts if you want to get in touch. Thank you.
Right, now I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Philine Ermgassen, who will be from the University of Edinburgh, who will be presenting Raising the Ambition of Marine Restoration to the Seascape Scale.
Thank you, Alison.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you to the two previous speakers for teeing up all the heavy theory, because what I'm now going to do is spend the next 15 minutes talking much more emotively about conversations that I've had with colleagues over the time, and this is based on a kind of perspective note that Joe and Bill Sanderson and I put together, just thinking about where next with seascapes. And as always, turning our frustration into optimism, because I think that is a very key skill when you're working in restoration. So Joe's already touched in a lot of detail on what seascape restoration is, but we're always thinking about multiple habitats, resilience, connectivity, functionality, and as we've seen from the two previous talks, that can happen at a relatively small spatial scale. But connectivity can also happen over a very large spatial scale, and that is really key because we have huge ambition. The restoration agenda in Europe has huge ambition. As Joe already touched on with the policies, the new nature restoration regulations are calling for 20% of sea areas by 2030 to be on the way to being restored. 30% of habitat area not in good condition should be on that path as well by 2030. So seascape restoration isn't just connectivity, it's also restoration at scale. And there's a really good theoretical framework for why it's important that we don't lose sight of that scale and we keep pushing for scale. We want to restore processes. A lot of these processes function at relatively large scales, and in particular, if you want to think about enabling conditions for passive recovery, the places where we really know we can get bang for buck. We want to build resilience. There's multiple global threats, climate change not being the least of them, and clearly thinking about a large scale is also really critical in terms of a restoration planning for building that resilience. Only at a large scale can we start to achieve economies of scale. It's really expensive to do marine restoration. It's especially expensive when you're doing it by hand on teeny tiny areas. It's logistically exhausting and expensive. But most importantly, we have to think about restoring at scale because there is an absolutely huge need. So coming to the habitat that calls most on my heartstrings, and it's been mentioned a couple of times already today, the European native oyster. Its current baseline is collapsed. Together with colleagues, we put together, applied the IUCN ecosystem red listing using historical data and current data. And basically what we see is there are relic habitats remaining. There are small patches of reefs, of habitats, some of them even at relatively high densities, but at really small spatial scales, maybe 20 meters squared. And these small habitat patches, they might be doing a little bit of self-recruitment. You can see with the solid line. There's a lot of, a few larvae flittering off into the greater seascape, but then not much else is happening. These are small patches. They're not functioning as an ecosystem should function, and they're not providing these really big-scale ecosystem services that we would hope to see. So if we really take this lens, something that restoration is really good at doing is thinking about processes. If we think about what processes we need to restore from the ecosystem of the native oyster in Europe, we want to restore larval abundance so that we can put things out and larvae will settle. We want to think about substrate availability. We've taken all this shell out as we fished. We need to think about where we should put that back so that we can start seeing this natural recovery. We need to think about larval connectivity at a larger spatial scale. And we also need to think about mediating these predator-prey interactions. We have a hugely disrupted system, and that has trophic level interactions and impacts. But this isn't new. We keep talking about it like it's new and it's exciting, and it is. I'm very excited, as you can tell. And it's hugely challenging to do in the marine, but it is absolutely not a new concept. The terrestrial restoration teams have been doing this for years. When we think about restoring a forest, which wonderfully is poetically often compared to oyster reefs, they are restoring those processes. They're planting trees, and when there's not enough soil, this FAO report toolbox says, well then, add some soil. If there are seed sources present, great, then you might get passive regeneration. And yeah, you might need to, think about your grazing pressure if your trees aren't coming back. So all of these processes are something we have a huge familiarity with. And I think sometimes we're our own enemy at saying how novel we are. We have the skills, we have the theoretical framework, we know what needs to be done, but we need to do it much, much more. Our seas are in a terrible state. Very nearly used an inappropriate word. And it's just key that we need just so many more oysters than we think about. A standard restoration project in Europe that uses adult oysters are generally put out somewhere around 10,000 oysters. That would be seen as a real milestone, maybe 30,000 for some of the really big restoration projects. Let's put that into perspective. I spend a lot of time digging through historical documents. It's so fun. But we look through these historical documents. This is the number of oysters that were removed per day from some of these reefs. So if we look just around Milford Haven, from one of the reefs around Milford Haven, they describe there being 1,000 to 1,200 oysters in 3 or 4 hours being collected from each boat. Each boat. And if we look then at the Isle of Man, they had a really huge reef off the Isle of Man. It's some fantastic descriptions, also from the 1800s. It took 20 boats, 7 years to dredge away these oysters. There is a fathom more water on the bed now than when they began to dredge. They have literally removed the reef, and they can measure the difference. The oysters were thick on the bed, and they used to spat. There's no dredging on it now, as there are no more oysters. No more oysters to dredge. One boat got 30,000 oysters in a week, and we're putting back maybe 10,000, maybe 30,000 in a year. So we are talking about needing a lot more if we want to start thinking about self-sustaining reefs. We want to think about the scales of hundreds of meters. We want to think about multiple reefs together, connected, lots of larval flow and connectivity, and then beginning to see this recovery of ecosystem services between these different habitats. And we know from the historical literature that the oysters should be abundant. There are, Mobius was a very famous German natural historian in the late 1800s who's kind of famously described oyster reefs. He was describing hugely degraded oyster reefs. These oyster reefs, there was evidence of fisheries decline in the early 1700s in the reefs that he was surveying in the late 1800s. But he does have one little tidbit in among his texts where he's talking about a previously undisturbed reef, and therefore the oysters were accordingly found in their natural condition. And upon every old oyster which was taken, they found 9 to 10 young ones of different ages. That's the habitat, that's the ecosystem that we were talking about. And we do have modern analogies over small spatial scales, and usually where predation pressure has in some way been mediated through the design. Stéphane Pauvreau has gone around many locations in France, and he's documented that you can find evidence of reefs at multiple different stages. So we know that they should be forming reefs. But actually, when I get really excited, when I really want to think, like, what did an oyster reef look like? How did it feel? How did it smell? Then I actually turned to a gentleman called Krøyer, who was writing in Danish in the earlier 1800s, around 1837. But he surveyed documents going back to the 1700s on the oyster reefs. But he also went out and surveyed oyster reefs. He looked at So he wrote, the oyster, which, as we've seen above, is itself spineless, and consequently a peaceful animal, is given its price a great many enemies. It is this circumstance which makes the oyster banks so interesting to a zoologist. One can probably always be sure with the oyster dredge of drawing up from the sea between the oysters a host of other animals whose amusement is undoubtedly largely derived from the oyster. Such animals were various species of crabs, starfish, snails, worms, etc. Although the oyster by its shell should appear to be amply protected against these enemies, it will be evident from what follows that even the adult oyster does not always find a reassuring shelter in the armor with which nature has equipped it. Still less can this be the case with the infants. So great is the fertility of the oyster that I alone on our banks find a far greater number of young oysters. And when the full-grown oyster is drawn up from the depths, its shell is generally found lined with calcareous or membranous tubes, which serve as a dwelling place for various worms with barnacles, anemones, chitons, sea squirts, and similar immobile or unwieldy animals. The more of these there are, the more loopholes are formed, especially if there are 2 or 3 oysters together. For numerous small crabs the size of a grain of sand or that of a large pea. Oyster young, however, are comparatively rarely seen. I suppose because they are for the most part devoured by these many small but very abundant predators. What Krøyer is telling us is it's a numbers game. And it's not just a question of having a lot of oysters in one place. It's the scale of these reefs. Typically, when we think about oyster habitats now, we're restoring them on a few meters squared. If we're lucky, tens of meters. When we look back through the historical literature, and this is work led by Ruth Thurston and myself, we could find many descriptions of really, really large reefs. And we pulled those all out, both in terms of area and in terms of length. And there are very few maps also where you can see it. And this is a map from France in the early 1900s, and the different coloration shows which beds were already very, very trashed or less slightly trashed. But what we tend to see from looking at all these records together is that very, very few oyster reefs are less than a hectare when they're described. Most of them are between a hectare and a kilometre squared, and many of them are even much larger than that. So we need to start thinking at this larger spatial scale. And it's not just about spatial scale on that small scale. When we look across Europe and try and record where we were able to find these evidence of these oyster reefs, ecosystems, not habitats, really huge ecosystems, there's records from almost everywhere around Europe. Predominantly around the coast of France, Germany, Denmark, Great Britain, Ireland, but also up to Sweden, down around in the Adriatic, in the Mediterranean, really excellent records there as well. They were abundant, they were connected. And we know from other bivalve species that there can be really large-scale connectivity. So this is work on Moriolus with Bill Sanderson and his colleagues. And they showed that in terms of Moriolus, there was connectivity between populations over the scale of hundreds of kilometers or tens of kilometers, or sometimes not. You know, it's a little bit random, but you do get connectivity between these populations at these large scales. And when you start to have more oysters covering more area at more locations, that's when we start to see these ecosystem scale impacts. So some early work I did in the US on historical ecology, we were looking at ecosystem level impacts on a kind of estuary scale. They have a very estuarine species, and we could show there that based on historical ecology, if you put all the oysters back in where they were, they'd be filtering the full volume of the estuary, in some cases tens of time within the residence time of that water body. So these were having a really exerted effect on the amount of phytoplankton, on nutrient cycling, on energy, on trophic cascades within those systems, had there been the historical numbers of oysters. In Europe, it's a coastal system. We have far less detail because we started harvesting them a lot earlier. But we were able to find some examples in our historical ecology work of ecosystem level impacts of this ecosystem. And probably the most compelling one is about the oystercatcher, which is this very charming coastal bird you find all over the world. And it's called the oystercatcher, but there's a lot of discussion already from the 1800s saying, why is it called the oystercatcher? It predominantly eats worms and mussels, doesn't eat oysters. But we found this description from 1801 in a German natural historical text. It's a very hefty tome where this person has described everything they've seen in their lives, from what I can tell. And they describe it as, and again, sorry for the translation, it's probably not perfect, but they say it's not just the oystercatcher, it's got multiple names. It's the oystercatcher, the oyster thief, the oyster collector. You see the theme. So named is one bird out of the order of marsh birds. During the end tide, he seems particularly happy when he runs about making chipping noises and seeks his food, which is primarily made up of oysters. The bird knows how to expertly break open the shells without injuring its beak on the sharp edges. And if they're too firmly closed, then it hits it on a rock so that they pop open. If it cannot find oysters, then it enjoys mussels, snails, other worms, and discarded dead animals. You don't find the native oyster intertidally anymore, which is very much why people didn't think this was relevant. Historically, we did find oysters intertidally. We have descriptions of them from the historical literature. This clearly seems to evidence that as well. It's quite common, we see also from our historical ecology work on the west coast of the US, where I did a lot of work in Willapa Bay, that we have source and sink populations when you have a metapopulation. And quite often, you'll have these sink populations. In this example, most likely the intertidal oysters, they don't do well in really cold winters. We know that for a fact, it's biological, they tend to die off. But if you have a huge amount of oysters in the sea nearby, those intertidal areas quickly become repopulated again. So they might be a sink population, but if they're quickly getting repopulated again, they can still be serving a really important functional niche. But that isn't possible if you don't have enough oysters reseeding. That's my thesis. And all this historical context, it really, really matters. And it matters because our current baseline is so unbelievably shifted that when in the late 1990s, they were thinking about what should be a biogenic reef, what should be included in our SACs, they actually reached the conclusion that about native oysters, in many locations, they were almost certainly the remnants of culture activities. And it is doubtful if natural beds would qualify as reefs in any case. And this was the conclusion they reached by looking at what was there now. And it is now, currently, kind of a feature of subtidal mixed sediments. It was not reef building in enough locations that they felt compelled that there wasn't any evidence. And this bears through to our OSPAR definition of 5 oysters per metre squared. And although there's no spatial definition in OSPAR, Marine Scotland have said they apply that to a 5 by 5 metre square approach. And this legislation is hugely critically important. It's not to undervalue it. These small habitat patches are absolutely vital, and this legislation is absolutely critical for protecting those areas, but we can't set it as our reference for restoration. We have to think bigger, we have to think bolder. We can't let our modus operandi, our collapsed system, be what we're trying to work towards. We really need to start thinking about, can we get reefs kind of complex systems where there's soft mud, sands in between, and then reefs, and then, or maybe even like that Isle of Man reef, really 3D structures, really densely occupied by oysters. That's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about our reference. And large scale, we're suggesting, and there's a discussion that Joe and Bill and I have had throughout the time, is, we need the large scale. We need the large scale to start to see success. Because without that, we don't have all these underlying bits that give us our functional ecosystem. And it's not that, this is not new. Already more than 10 years ago, around 10 years ago, seagrass experts were saying the same thing. They were saying, it's all great, you can have a little test plot, but if it's teeny tiny, you're not getting propagules, and anything can come along and squish it, and its risk of going extinct is very high. So what we need is not to put all our eggs in one basket. We need multiple baskets. And then we need to not put very few eggs in each basket. We need to put a lot of eggs in each basket. And that's when we can start to spread the risk, and we can start to see that recovery feedback loop. And this is also important, like I said earlier, for resilience. This is a recent map from the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership. They've just released this report. They included looking at native oysters. And this is just for Great Britain, but they show that under climate change scenarios, oysters around Britain will be one of the winners, so to speak. There'll be more habitats and more areas available to them. We need to start thinking about this in terms of our resilience for the future. Where should we be doing restoration work? How can we plan for that into the future? So the real question is, how do we get there? And I think through our debates, we've reached the conclusion that we need three things. We need ambition, we need money, and we need to overcome these practical limitations that we're kind of struggling with in some cases. And to overcome that, what we need is a policy framework that is ambitious. And we have that with the Nature Restoration Regulation. What's important now is that we really support those governments as they're making their national restoration plans in making sure that ambition isn't lost in translation, that they are looking to a good reference state. They're not just being trapped by existing legislation, existing ideas of what a biogenic reef looks like under the Habitats Regulations Directive. To go with that, then obviously, if you've got these big ideas, you need funding that's ambitious, and you need to be willing to accept risk. Not everything is going to work. You need to put multiple eggs in multiple baskets. Some baskets are going to break. And ultimately, by doing this, we can then unlock these economies of scale. So ultimately, this all boils down to one thing. We need ambition, but we need much more ambition. Thank you for listening. I'm really looking forward to the engaging conversations. And I'd like to thank Ruth Sauls and John Dixon for some really engaging conversations in the run-up to planning this talk. And obviously, Joe, Bill, and everyone else on the network for being so great, stimulating. Thank you.
We're going to move on to our final talk, which is by Professor Martin Gullström of the University of Södertörn in Sweden.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizing team for inviting me here to this very exciting and timely symposium. It's very nice to be here. I also thank the three former speakers for starting and giving this big picture and exciting picture in detail of oysters. And yeah, I will take an approach now to move the seascape ecology approach towards the climate mitigation through blue carbon. So that is what I will. The link between seascape ecology and blue carbon sequestration capacity will be my focus, and how this reinforces conservation, restoration, prioritizations besides the climate change mitigation. I will mostly look into the linkages and then like a prerequisites for the restoration part in a way. So first of all, a seascape approach benefits restoration and conservation, obviously, and the prioritization of how to set it up, of all types of ecosystem services. And blue carbon sequestration and blue carbon storage is a very important one that also contributes to climate regulation and in terms of safeguarding sustainable climate governance. However, there are very busy coastal seascapes in many areas around the world, not all, but in some areas it's extreme. Many users, many activities going on, and there is competition for space. And that's why marine spatial planning or spatial planning on land is That's two very important managing tools for managers. And the multiple or cumulative environmental stressors are one of the biggest problems, of course, that is linked to this, which is very important for management, conservation, and restoration efforts. And another key challenge for seascape restoration is when conserving, restoring nature and nature's contribution to people while achieving the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations. This will lead to trade-offs as well as synergies. For example, meeting climate goals while maintaining nature and nature's contribution to people. Or another example, conserving and restoring nature while contributing positively to human well-being. That's could be easy, we think so, but it's also very important. It's very important with thresholds. Where is the threshold to solving those kind of important questions? I think most of you know what blue carbon is, maybe not all, but anyway, formulates carbon sequestration is the process of capture through photosynthesis or through trapping from surrounding environment or habitats, and long-term storage of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And in IPCC, in their guidelines, they mention it as all biologically driven carbon fluxes and storage in marine systems that are amenable to management, which includes then both biophysical and social aspects. Salt marshes, mangroves and seagrasses are often, or those were the key habitats from the beginning when the blue carbon concept was coined, 2009. They have been, of course, important before that, but that was an expression from blue carbon expression to highlight them very much from about 15 years ago. They are very important around the world, very threatened. We have heard it already, not least here in United Kingdom, but also in where I come from, in Sweden. Seagrasses are very threatened, for example. Nowadays, since a number of years, there is a very much focus on other habitats that are potential or emergent or unrecognized blue carbon habitats. It could be coastal forest, different types of wetlands, reed beds, clubrush or bulrush, or not least macroalgae that has been highlighted since about 10 years ago as an indirect effect in shallow and in deep ocean sediments. So this is important research going on nowadays to recognize and to understand those. There are many threats, as I mentioned, and this is a major issue nowadays, to measure all those greenhouse gases coming out from the systems when they are intact, but primarily also when they are disturbed. The carbon dioxide, methane, but also other type of greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide. So if we take an example when it comes to blue carbon, if we have an efficient carbon sink, let's say it's a shelter embayment where we have not too much of human disturbance, we have a high carbon accumulation in, for example, a seagrass bed, and some export of carbon, but still a good blue carbon environment with long-term storage of carbon. If this environment is very disturbed by human activities, for example, and the habitat itself will degrade, there might be a lot of erosion of carbon, the export might increase, and in the end a lot of greenhouse gases might enter the atmosphere, and that is one of the major problems. From a recent study we did on the Swedish west coast on some sediment cores, we found that seagrass colonization started about 2,000 years ago, and restoration efforts as I can see it will not mirror the old carbon layers, at least not in a very long time. So that is something that is very important for managers, of course. So we talked about scale, or actually the former speakers talked about scale, and that different scales matters. And so I will give you just an overview of the scales that are interacting with blue carbon stock dynamics. If we look into the biggest sort of scale that we consider in management, maybe 100 to 1,000 of kilometers, we see those major gradients. In Sweden, we have a gradient around our coastline from oceanic water to fresh water. So salinity is on that scale. Temperature in the water, in the air, and ice cover can be also here. Tens of kilometers, then we talk maybe, it could be bigger or smaller, of course, but catchment area is in this scale level, and geomorphology, land runoff, and also proximity and size to different sort of human disturbances or human environments, or so to speak, and agriculture and forestry and so on. Hundreds of meters to kilometer, that's a sort of seascape perspective from when we talk about patches. Patch numbers, patch richness, or the proportion of the habitat that are in investigation, or the proportion of other types of seascape habitats, habitat connectivity, and so on. All of those are seascape scale predictors. While, of course, the smaller scales are very, very important for blue carbon storage and the sequestration processes, but like sediment and plant properties and microbial processes. But those drivers are also influenced by seascape connectivity and habitat quality from source to sink and so on. So now I will go through a number of factors that are very important in seascape scale associations to blue carbon stocks, mostly from our research, but some other also, mostly focusing on seagrasses as sort of the main habitat, primarily because I come from the seagrass science quite a lot. One big study we have done, research that are in progress, or actually in the final part, we are writing the manuscript and have reached quite far. This is to explore the influence of seascape configuration, composition, and connectivity of coastal blue carbon stock and size and composition. We have been in almost 150 coastal seascapes, and several hundreds of sediment cores were part of this study, from the tropical Tanzania down to subtropical southern Mozambique. And 6 different habitats, seagrasses, 4 seagrass meadow types dominated by different species, mangroves and unvegetated areas. And we look into many seascape metrics, 32 in this case, which are related to either habitat, like this, areal proportion, or the distance to focal habitat, different types of habitats, or more coastal settings, habitat diversity, or distance to large rivers, or sediment properties in terms of runoff and erosion per time, and also human activities in terms of, for example, areal extent, pasture and cropland, and human impacts in different ways. And the association between the seascape and the blue carbon varies, and I show now an example from 3 of the habitats, seagrasses, which are placed, located in sort of a gradient from land near shore environment a bit deeper. And those statistical analysis, we don't have to go into those, but what you have to do to know is that the predictors from the left to the right is sort of an importance gradient. And if they go up, they are positive to blue carbon, and if they go down, they are negative to blue carbon stocks. And my message here is that different environments have different drivers in different sort of settings. So those that are near the shore were actually correlated to human activity metrics, while those further out were more connected to the habitat surrounding, sort of. So seascape configuration and composition is important. Both are important, but it depends on species-specific characteristics and placement. And we have in an earlier study also shown that organic carbon in seagrass sediment is higher in continuous environments compared to patchy environments, not necessarily fragmented, but patchy. And the same big data set, we looked into the influence of protection, because there are different types of protection in this environment, not only MPAs, but also conservation areas of different types. And we found no influence of protection on this. And why so? Yeah, we think, and we interpret it as sort of a result of site selection at implementation, which was in this case, many of them were implemented in the 90s or early 90s, when maybe it was a focus on other aspects such as coastal protection or biodiversity or other reasons than focusing on climate change mitigation or blue carbon. The influence of hydrodynamics can be very important, and we can see from a study in Portugal where a decreased current flow makes a higher, or a link to a higher organic carbon stock. A study from Australia showed that hydrodynamic settings might affect the carbon stocks quite a lot in estuaries. For example, in the interior part, it was a lot higher than in the fringing part. And in our own studies, we have seen that wave exposure is a very, it's correlative to at least the upper percentage of carbon with higher levels in the more sheltered areas. Also, source to sink environments are linked to land to sea gradients. And we can see from Aurora Ricard and colleagues from an Australian study where the seagrasses in the sediment are higher in a gradient from the shore and out to the more offshore environment of the coast, while other habitats can be seen in the sediment in higher levels, more in the interior part. We also found from a recent published study in brackish, we focus on brackish Baltic semi-enclosed bays, where we saw land-sea characteristics that it matters. Coastal morphology in terms of topographic bay openness was the main predictor of sedimentary organic carbon, as well as nitrogen. And the extent of open land in the catchment area and cover of submerged vegetation were also important predictors in this study. So morphometrically isolated shallow coastal areas constitute significant sinks for sediment carbon storage in brackish waters. Also, we have heard a lot about seascape connectivity. I don't go into it in details like that, but the strength and patterns might vary, and it's important to take into consideration. And not least the lateral export of carbon, and what type of carbon, because it will end up in different quality of carbon. Is it a solving organic carbon or particular organic carbon coming from land to the sea, and how does it look like when we look into the fluxes or emissions of different greenhouse gases on land, different habitats on the sea. So that is important. We found in a study in the northern Madagascar that connectivity of generated very clear land-to-sea patterns when we found in a degraded area. A degraded mangrove area affected very much the seagrass environment outside. We looked into the stable isotopes of the seagrasses, and we found a lot more mangrove-related organic matter in the nearby areas. than seagrass parts. So mangrove deforestation clearly affected pathway and fate of refractory carbon. Another land use change and perspective is urban development. We did a study on Zanzibar in Tanzania, in this tropical environment, in this small island, which the biggest city, 1973, you can see in one of the, not so easy to see maybe in the photos, but it has grown until today very much, this city, and we could see that the carbon differed with time and was related to urban development. And also relocating of a sewage outlet showed very different patterns in the different environments. I will finish up with have a few slides about a new, not new project, but a big project on climate change mitigation capacity of the Baltic coastal seascape that I lead. We are about 25 scientists or PhD students nowadays in 10 different organizations, mostly universities, which is about identifying hotspot environments for coastal carbon sequestration and guidance for sustainable management of Baltic coastal landscapes under global change. And we have different work packages here and on landscape mapping and all about carbon sink function and connectivity. And we link this in the end. We have not started with work package 4, which is where we link to climate mitigation, but we have linked it to work package 5 and are working on policy guidance and climate governance already. You can find it, we have a homepage that we are, it's in progress, but it's out, so it's, you can find some information about it. I just want to mention a 3-year field study that all of us, we were many people out in field and were getting a lot of samples in 45 coastal seascapes, each comprised of 2 to 4 habitats on land, 3 to 4 habitats in the sea. And all of this we are working on now and looking into numerous of seascape aspects and look at potential predictors of carbon sequestration. And in the end, we will upscale each of those seascapes, the land and sea habitats involved and connectivity models, upscale those to seascape level and downscale climate models. So there we will meet and try to see what the different types of seascapes will contribute to the climate mitigation part. We'll see if we succeed, but it's interesting at least. We work with proper climate modelers to do this, otherwise it's difficult. One of my PhD students, I just mentioned, one of her studies is now, she has just finished and will submit this within 2 weeks, mapping coastal blue carbon habitats across Swedish seascapes. She's looking into recognized and unrecognized or emergent coastal blue carbon habitats and also assess the potential influence from land-based human activities like agricultural areas and urban areas in a landscape analysis. And another PhD student, both of them, their names are Sarah Brown and Forsberg, is assessing, her first study is assessing the influence of carbon quality on methane production, and with the aim of understanding the organic carbon originated from different macrophytes and how this might affect methane production. It's based on a small scale. We have done it in field as well, but here is a laboratory work on 640 days, and we look at different sources here, macrophytes. And the findings are important for sourcing linkages across the land-sea continuum in there. So key messages for seascape restoration with focus on carbon sequestration capacities. Seascape context matters, but may depend on species-specific characteristics and placement. Large continuous seascape habitats can show higher carbon sink capacity than patchy seascapes. Urban development and habitat deforestation affect pathway and fate of refractory carbon, and land-to-sea gradients can be strong and forced by catchment area runoff and local hydrodynamics. Coastal morphology was an important predictor of sediment carbon storage and quality, and protection success may not may depend on reasons behind site selections of implementation of MPAs. And finally, seascape connectivity patterns influence carbon quality by altering the supply and movement patterns. So the research clearly demonstrates benefits of using a seascape ecology approach to understanding coastal carbon sequestration capacity. And this contributes to safeguard vital climate regulation services and to support policymakers for successful planning of seascape scale restoration and preservation, rewilding, and multi-habitat systems. Thanks to my closest colleagues, Mats Björk, Maria Asplund, Martin Dahl, and Sara, the PhD students, as well as former PhD students from Tanzania, Liberatus Lymo, and Rashid Ismail, and many, many other co-working colleagues and the funders. And thank you very much, all of you, and I would like to say what Sir David Attenborough said in the new movie Ocean. After living for nearly 100 years on this planet, I now understand the most important place on Earth is not on land, but at the sea. So, thank you.